Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. As violent protests rattle the United States, markets, in fact, rally, showing the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street. Investors looking towards an economic recovery as more states reopen, despite some businesses and communities in ruins. This, as darkness falls across the country, curfews will go into effect in many major cities across the United States in preparation for more passionate and at times violent demonstrations and even looting. Amazon is changing its delivery routes to adjust and avoid the clashes. Apple closing some stores. Twitter has changed its Bluebird black in solidarity with the protesters protesting out there in memory of George Floyd. Let's not forget this, the African-American man who died at the hands of police. Meantime, a rare virtual walkout at Facebook. Employees protesting Mark Zuckerberg's decision to not flag a tweet from a post from President Trump suggesting that looters be shot. And earlier today, the president calling out governors, saying they need to crack down more. If you don't dominate, the president said, you are wasting your time. We've been speaking with law enforcement officers, with lawmakers across the day on Bloomberg Television. Let's take a listen to what they have had to say.
I think protesting is only a beginning to allow us to express our pain for over the years, and it's our calling out to have something done. You cannot legislate away racism.
Well, the emphasis should be on quality of life, quality of issues, and making sure we speak to those issues. You know, residential, recreation, economics, education, and safety.
There should never be a, quote, bad cop on any police department in the world, because if someone's bad, they don't deserve to be a cop.
Clearly, recent examples tell us that the training has to be improved, it has to be better, it has to be more comprehensive in large departments and small.
We have a crisis on top of a crisis with a side of crisis. And so what we have to do is continue to extend the hand of help and say that we're going to get to the other side.
We're going to talk about the market moves first. Despite these protests unfolding across the country, despite rising tension with China, despite lackluster results on vaccine developments for COVID-19, you're seeing markets rally. I want to bring in our markets correspondent, Abigail Doolittle, who's been across all the movements. So, Abigail, I don't understand. Gains for the majors despite all of this. Why?
It's pretty extraordinary, Emily, and I think that you're not the only person to be surprised by this. There was some talk over the weekend wondering whether or not we would see futures down Sunday evening yesterday, and that really was never the case. Small fluctuations earlier today, but we're looking at solid gains on the close. And this has to do with the fact that you have investors and traders at this point very much trained, if you will, by the Fed, because we once again have a weak dollar down for a third day in a row. So the Fed's got the markets back. So investors are looking past the fundamentals. And at this point, it's not just the economic data, 40 million people losing their jobs. It also has to do with this this horrific and sad backdrop across our country with these, in many cases, peaceful protests. One that I saw was very peaceful and very powerful, but in other cases you do have the violence and looting. But investors looking right past that on the weak dollar. Plus, they're giving you the assessment that right now, at least, it's unlikely to affect the corporate profit outlook here. However, if it does turn into a situation where COVID-19 cases spike due to the proximity of the protesters and other physical situations around the protesting, that could, in fact, affect the U.S. economy. So you may see that reflected in stocks at some point in the future. Let's hope that that does not happen. Where we did see some of the China tensions, though, Emily, that has to do with the chip sector. Of course, very sensitive to China. Many of the companies, including Qualcomm and Micron, receive a lot of their revenue from China. So the stocks was actually down just a little bit, including some of those big chip names.
Let's talk a little bit more about this U.S.-China tension. As you mentioned, we're in the middle of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and now a social crisis on top of, rising perhaps U.S.-China relations hitting a new low. How did you see that reflected in the market, if at all?
Well, so it's interesting because we have some of those chip stocks here in the U.S. trading lower, but China shares themselves are actually higher. So the only thing that I can put behind that, so on Friday, of course, President Trump had the press conference. Some traders were expecting sanctions against China. They were also expecting the possibility of a repeal of the Phase 1 trade deal. That did not happen. So many folks saying that President Trump more talked the talk as opposed to walking the walk. However, over the weekend, China is retaliating with these asking some of their state-owned agricultural companies to not buy ag goods from the U.S., so perhaps seen as a step up for China. So you have a lot of the China shares rallying. One of the ETFs or indexes that's comprised of China shares rallied significantly on the day, along with China Tech up more than 3%. But on the year, Emily, we do still have the NASDAQ 100, or that big tech index, leading China shares. The tensions, though, could really continue. That, of course, has been one of the big drivers of volatility over the last couple of years, and it seems as though it is in a stage of re-escalating. So this could just be early innings in terms of what the effect is on the markets.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, thank you so much for breaking it down. To dive into these U.S.-China tensions, I want to bring in Sam Sachs, Cybersecurity Policy Fellow from New America. Sam, always good to have you here on the show. Of course, you've got President Trump criticizing China for, quote unquote, curbing freedoms in Hong Kong. Meantime, happening against a backdrop of these violent and passionate protests unfolding across the United States. Yet the president saying that the United States should crack down on the freedoms of these protesters. How do you imagine this is all being viewed by Beijing?
Beijing media has leapt all over this, pointing out the paradox. And I think they've really taken hold of this and said, look, how can you have a president talking about the National Guard shooting protesters in Minneapolis when we haven't even deployed the PLA in Hong Kong? Imagine how that would be seen by U.S. media if the PLA was deployed to Hong Kong. So they're really running with it.
So does this then undermine U.S. credibility as, President Trump is throwing out these threats and taking steps that could be quite traumatic if he follows through?
It does. And I think that it's not just governments like China that are pointing out the paradox. I think you're seeing around the world, democracies and autocracies alike are saying, look, the U.S. has a democratic crisis at home. We're in no position to go around the world lecturing others about these issues. Now, I think that we should be able to hold governments like Beijing accountable without falling into a political relativism trap. But I think it certainly weakens our standing to do so at this moment.
Now, Chinese government officials have told state-run agricultural companies to pause purchases of U.S. farm goods, including soybeans. What does this mean for the U.S. economy? What does this mean for the U.S.-China tension?
So I think this is actually a lot less than they could have done. The other week, the Chinese government threatened to roll out the unreliable entities list, which has been this looming threat ever since the Huawei saga began. And what this could do is it could force a number of U.S. companies that really rely on the revenue from China to potentially exit the market or face harsh penalties there. They haven't done that yet. So we're still waiting to see how will Beijing retaliate against a spate of measures that are coming out in the United States. So far, they're threats. Let's see if this is just bluster or not.
Now, you've got the phase one trade deal still intact for now, but the president, the White House, has already taken steps toward tightening restrictions on Huawei, potential legislation involving the delisting of Chinese companies that are listed in the United States, visa restrictions. What of what the president is doing or threatening could have the most bite?
So there's a whole lot going on right now. I think that the actions against Huawei, the actions against Huawei and the bill that would compel Chinese companies to delist from U.S. stock exchanges, these to me are the things to watch. These would have the biggest bite. With Huawei, what they did is they said, look, if you are a foreign supplier of Huawei, we're not talking about U.S. direct suppliers, but you use U.S. components, whether it's semiconductor manufacturing equipment or software, you now have to have a license to sell to Huawei. And what this does is it cuts to the heart of Huawei's ability to be self-reliant, because they can't survive without U.S. components if they also can't survive without their vendors around the world that are also dependent on the U.S. So that's number one. The threat to delist Chinese firms, it's called the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. And what this says is Chinese companies would have to certify that they're not under the control of a foreign government, or then essentially, if that doesn't happen for 3 years, delist. What that could mean is you could see companies like Alibaba, Baidu, JD.com, and others actually delist from U.S. stock exchanges if it comes to pass.
Meantime, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a pandemic. Of course, President Trump has blamed China for the coronavirus and for mishandling the coronavirus. You've had similar accusations coming out of Beijing about the United States. You know, how could all of this play out in an election year for President Trump when, you know, a lot of what he's doing, especially with regards to China, is further mobilizing his base?
So if you are Trump looking at an election year and you have 100,000 U.S. lives plus an economy that is back to levels not seen since the Great Depression, what do? You blame China. I think that particularly in swing states, particularly in purple states, the Trump administration was really relying on the health of the economy to be a boon and help him get over them at the margins to win this election. And now, I think you have to blame China. Otherwise, this catastrophe is on your hands, and I don't see how he gets through the election otherwise.
All right, Sam Sachs of New America, thank you so much. Always appreciate your thoughts here on this show. Meantime, as we prepare for more protests, potentially violent protests to happen overnight here in the United States, we're going to be speaking with a U.S. Congressman of New York coming up. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. The U.S. plunged into a health and economic crisis and now a social crisis as well. Lawmakers have been reacting all day long to the wave of protests we've seen across the country following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. To provide more perspective on that, as well as some of the fans being flamed on social media, I want to bring in Congressman Gregory Meeks, a longtime civil rights activist who represents the 5th District of New York, which includes Queens and part of Long Island, both deeply affected by the pandemic and impacted by now these protests as well. Congressman Meeks, thank you so much for joining us. So first of all, what are your thoughts on the current situation? What is the way forward for this nation?
Well, I think that, I think the voices have really spoken for themselves, and that we need criminal justice reform, and we need to look at how we end some of the disparities that COVID-19 has shown, apparently that's in Black and brown communities. It's something that the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has been talking about for years and have put budgets forward so that we can end those disparities and get something that would be equitable as far as the justice system is concerned. I can tell you something that I've been dealing with all of my life.
There will now be a curfew in New York City tonight, starting at 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. There's been some pushback about how New York police officers have responded. What's your message to law enforcement and to the protesters?
But number one, as I said, I think that to those, overwhelmingly, those individuals that have protested have been nonviolent and peaceful and demonstrations, and I think those are very effective. In fact, if I've been myself arrested at times for peaceful demonstrations, but not where you are, throwing Molotov cocktails or putting things on fire or anything of that nature. That then takes away from the message. But the message needs to be loud and clear that the kind of killing that took place of George Floyd at the hands of four Minneapolis police officers has to stop. We've seen our share of that in New York. And so that's what the message has to be. Now, what took place in my district yesterday, there was a demonstration in the middle of my protest in the middle of my district yesterday. And as the protesters came toward the precinct, many, well, just about all, led by commanding officer of the precinct, and others, they simply took a Kaepernick knee in recognition of what the issues were that the protesters was coming about. And as a result of that, as opposed to a confrontation and no acknowledgement of what took place and the wrong that has taken place with Mr. Floyd's case and a number of others, when you go to Aubrey in Georgia and other cases, the protesters appreciated and cheers broke out because they want recognition. And I think that recognition needs to also come from the police department. You do not, sit silently when you know that there was a wrong that was committed by someone who happened to wear a law enforcement uniform like you. That's one of the first steps. The blue wall of silence, and although, or hiding and behind the so-called brotherhood of police, when you see and know that someone has done something wrong, that silence can't continue. If you are good. I mean, Dr. King said, in the end, we won't remember the bad language or the bad acts of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And so we need police officers to also stand up.
You mentioned Dr. King there. I mean, it's a stark reminder that so many issues, so many things haven't changed, certainly when it comes to racism and racial injustice in this country. One thing that has changed is technology, and you're seeing so much information, video, images, commentary being shared across social media, which is, in many ways the proof, the hope for justice, but also at times the gasoline, especially if some of these images or moments are shared without context. What's been your impression of how the information about what happened initially about these protests has spread across social media?
But I just hope that what the key is, you need to focus on what caused the protest in the beginning. That's where it is. Now, surely there's been some individuals who I don't think are there or interested in protesting at all. Some are there to try to take advantage of a situation. Thus, you found, for example, we saw in Minnesota what took place. Some 85% of the individuals that were arrested were not from Minnesota. You go to Atlanta, Georgia, you saw that the major number of those individuals were not from Atlanta, Georgia. In fact, you saw those that were from Atlanta, Georgia, coming out the next day, understanding the need for having peaceful protests, but cleaning up their city. This is their city, and they're not there to destroy it. But the focus still, what some people would like to do, like the President of the United States, is to move the focus off of what was the root cause of what the problems are, where the majority of people are protesting and saying enough is enough. And I think that's where the focus must continue and remain.
Meantime, you've got Twitter putting a warning on President Trump's tweet suggesting that looters be shot. On the other hand, you have Facebook leaving up the president's post. Mark Zuckerberg saying that Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth. You've got employees at Facebook walking out virtually today because they're not happy with Facebook's decision. Who's right? Which company is right in terms of how they've handled the president's remarks? Twitter or Facebook?
I can tell you who's wrong. The President of the United States. They should not be put in a position. I personally think that Twitter is absolutely correct, because the president's statements are cited are there to ignite, not to soothe, not to bring together. He's trying to ignite. I want us to come together, work together. We need the police departments and the police officers working with people in the protest. We need to change where those inequities are, the disparities are in communities of color that we've seen. The type of language that the president is using is the type of a language that throws, that accelerates a fight and violence, not puts it out. So clearly the person that's in the wrong is the President of the United States.
That said, should Facebook then be taking more responsibility for what the president is saying on their platform? Should they be taking stronger actions, or, as some people say, is that censorship?
It's not censorship. If in fact you go into a theater and you shot fire, those are not what you call constitutional rights to free speech. that's exciting and causing the possibility of other individuals getting injured. That's what the president is doing. And so, I don't think that it's a violation of free speech. Now, if you want to talk about it, then you should talk and if you're going to allow those words to stand, you should also say something explicit about what those statements are, and that the statements are not, many of his statements are not accurate. And so don't leave it out there so that individuals think that what he's saying is accurate. Now, number one, because many people just look at social media and think that what is there is the truth. But folks and what this president has been doing for the last 3 years is using social media and Twitter to get around the press that is accurately depicting his actions. So he is doing that deliberately to get around those individuals who know what true journalism is and going and trying to utilize it in stories that most people would not ordinarily pay attention to because the regular media would not even be reporting it, or if they did report it, they would report the facts and the truth therein of what those remarks said and what they mean.
Meantime, the president has signed this executive order trying to curb the power of social media, and now that Twitter has taken the stand, they're going to have some more tough calls heading towards the election. What do you think Vice President Biden's should be doing here in terms of picking a VP? Do you have an opinion on what kind of person or who can join his ticket and put up a fight?
Look, obviously, I would love to see an African-American woman, but clearly the president has some great candidates to choose from. And so I reserve that right to the president, as all other candidates, to the vice president, as all other candidates have had the opportunity to choose a running mate that they feel is compatible with them and can best deliver their message. I am absolutely enthused, though, with Mr. Biden's decision to say that once he becomes president, his first selection to the Supreme Court will be an African-American woman. And that is key and essential, especially dealing with the issues that we're talking about today, criminal justice and others. I remind people often that even before the 63 and 64 and 65, the 64 and 65 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Bill, and even it was the Supreme Court that started making decisions in the 50s to change and to end what was Jim Crow rules and regulations. It is the Supreme Court appointees in the federal court that will outlast any president. So if we are talking about saying there was the Supreme Court that put in the Jim Crow rules over 100 years before that. So there was almost exactly an 85-year-old swing from when the Supreme Court put in and made Jim Crow legal until where it was finally overruled by the Supreme Court. And I want folks to be reminded that that's really is what is at stake at this election. So I am absolutely enthused with his decision to make sure that the next appointee, when he becomes president of the United States, will be an African-American woman.
Congressman, we have about 30 seconds left. You have the mayor of Atlanta urging protesters to go home because the city's already sustained so much damage. What is your quick message to Americans tonight?
Let's come together. We've seen with our own eyes what took place in Minnesota when clearly Mr. George Floyd was murdered. When you look at the chokehold that was put on him, and the other 3 officers were co-conspirators. Okay. But we need to come together as a nation. This is the greatest nation this planet has ever seen if we come together and not believe with our own eyes.
All right, come together. You said it well. New York Congressman Gregory Meeks, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, as I mentioned, Facebook employees staging a virtual walkout in response to the company's policy on the president's post. We'll talk about that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Senior Facebook employees are criticizing the decision made by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg not to label or fact check President Trump's post suggesting that looters be shot. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Sarah Fryer, who covers social media for us. Now, Sarah, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a virtual walkout or a walkout of any kind of Facebook employees. Has there? I mean, how big a deal is this?
This is a really big deal. This is a company that has been through years of controversy since the 2016 presidential election, and this is the first time that we're really seeing current employees. We've seen a lot of former employees, but this is current employees risking their jobs to come out and talk about their disagreement with Facebook's decision here. And what's also interesting is that Facebook is saying, go ahead. You know, we'll even let you walk out without using your vacation days. We'll support your right to protest our decision, which I think kind of is trying to take some steam out of it. But I don't know that that's going to work. People are pretty upset.
Some of the tweets, ironically, these Facebook employees are tweeting about their discontent. Jason Toff, an employee at Facebook, saying, I work at Facebook. I'm not proud of how we're showing up. The majority of coworkers I've spoken to feel the same way. We are making our voice heard. How many people are participating in this virtual walkout? How widespread is it?
It's been really hard to get a full sense because a lot of these employees are working virtually. So there's no like list of them. But I've seen a couple dozen tweets, which goes to show that, you know, it's not just the people who are speaking publicly, it's the people who are amplifying those voices. The entire React core team, which is an engineering team at Facebook that works on the user interface, has walked out. Several senior designers have walked out. So this is a pretty broad-based effort. I've seen employees from Instagram, from Facebook Messenger, from other teams, and I really have never seen anything like this from this company.
Meantime, Mark Zuckerberg has sort of doubled down on his decision. He's come out and explained why he came to this decision. We've also heard reportedly that he had a call with President Trump at the end of last week. What do we know about that, and how does it compare to the way decisions are being made at Twitter? Because there's been reporting that shows that Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, has made a sort of a more collaborative conclusion in ultimately deciding to put that warning label on President Trump's tweet. It wasn't just Jack Dorsey making that decision in a vacuum, but a decision effectively made by a team.
So Zuckerberg did have a call with Trump on Friday. According to our sources, Trump called him, which is pretty rare. They haven't talked very often. The last time we remember them doing so was when they had dinner organized by board member Peter Thiel. So Trump calls Zuckerberg, and Zuckerberg tells him that he is disappointed in the tone and rhetoric of the post and that he's putting Facebook in a difficult position. But there was no sort of transparency into what else was said, and a lot of employees have told me that they are concerned about that, about whether each time Facebook has to deal with a Facebook post from Trump that they are concerned about, that they'll go by it softly. They'll go to the White House and talk to the White House. Whereas you mentioned with Dorsey, he is talking to his team. He's deliberating with them. We have not heard about a Twitter deliberation with the White House.
That said, to be fair, Jack Dorsey has met with President Trump in the past. Talk to us about how Twitter is going to approach. Probably they're going to potentially have to make several difficult decisions as long as the president keeps tweeting towards Election Day. You know, now that Twitter has taken this stand, it's likely they're going to have to take it again. And what is the process in place for that?
Well, both companies are going to have to be consistent with whatever they decided today, or change it and cause us all to have another flurry of questioning. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for Twitter to be as aggressive as they've been in the last week with Trump's tweets, because it takes a lot of manpower to decide those things. And for Facebook, if they're planning on having a call with the White House every time Trump does something that steps close to the line, that's going to be very difficult for them too. So I think this is only going to get more heated in the run-up to the election when you have, this escalating violence, you have coronavirus, you have health misinformation, you have, the normal mudslinging between politicians, maybe even more escalated in this election because so much of the discussion is going to be on the internet because we're not going to have those big rallies we had in 2016. So we're going to see this really heat up, and it's very interesting to see all of this percolate now for the companies, and they're going to have to do something with Facebook is going to have to address its employees' concerns, and they do plan to have a company-wide meeting tomorrow where Zuckerberg is going to address questions. I hope that he opens it up to the public as he has in the past, but if not, we'll be reporting on it.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to your report on that. Bloomberg Sarah Frier, thank you so much for that update. Meantime, as we've discussed, the country's still in the middle of a health crisis, and with these protests happening, there are fresh concerns about new outbreaks of COVID-19. Earlier today, we spoke with Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Vice Dean Joshua Sharfstein about the latest insights on the virus, particularly when it comes to transmission and children. Take a listen.
We know that kids are less likely to get severe disease immediately, and they may be less likely to get sick in the first place. There's new evidence that kids have far fewer of the receptors that bind the coronavirus than adults do. At the same time, we're becoming aware of this rare inflammatory condition that can happen a couple weeks or a few weeks after infection that can be quite severe and even cause death. So it looks like it's a generally speaking mild disease, but there is a rare risk of a very severe complication. Schools that open have to be careful. It can't look like school did before the pandemic. They have to separate out the classes, keep kids with smaller groups of other kids, protect teachers, and probably prepare for a combination of online and in-person learning.
Josh, even if children don't actually get sick themselves, can they transmit the disease? Again, I've seen varying reports saying it's more difficult to transmit it, and others saying they transmit it just like adults.
I think generally speaking, they definitely can transmit it. It may be less frequently transmitted than adults because they're less likely to be coughing and sneezing and really sick. But they definitely can transmit it. So you have to imagine that there are some families, if there are very vulnerable people at home, that are going to be very nervous about sending their kids to school, and that's understandable. So I think most places are going to be offering an online option in that case. Same for teachers who may be particularly vulnerable, older teachers, teachers with chronic illness. May not be a good idea for them to be the first to return to the classroom.
Is this a blood vessel disease or is it a respiratory disease?
Well, there's definitely increasing evidence that the virus can invade the blood vessels. The same receptor I was talking about before exists on the cells that line the blood vessels, and when those cells get disrupted, you get a change in the environment for blood, and that can cause clotting. And we know that clotting is a major problem with coronavirus disease, and that's both big clots, which can clog catheters, and little clots, which cause the purple toes and other kinds of adverse problems, including heart attacks potentially and strokes.
Joshua Sharfstein there, the Vice Dean of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which of course is supported by Mike Bloomberg, the founder of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of this network. All right, coming up, we're going to talk about the Pentagon enlisting a company to defend itself against the coronavirus. We're going to hear from the CEO of FLIR, a company that makes thermal cameras, next. This is Bloomberg. Everyone is vulnerable to COVID-19, and that includes the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. The Pentagon is now working with FLIR, a sensing solutions company, to install thermal imaging cameras in its buildings to scan visitors for their temperatures. Joining us now to discuss, FLIR CEO James Cannon in an exclusive interview. So, James, tell us a little bit about this partnership and the work you're doing with the Pentagon.
Sure, Emily. For the better part of 17 years, we've had experience deploying our technology to screen for folks that could have elevated skin temperatures carrying a virus, really beginning with the SARS outbreak. So when we were asked to work with the Pentagon to install this technology at their visitor center, we're really important. Although it's a big building, there are thousands of people that come to work there every day, and so helping to have a screening technology to make them safe is something we're really proud to be a part of.
So talk to us about how the technology works and what separates it from other body temperature detectors.
Yeah, so we've pioneered infrared technology. Indeed, our name stands for forward-looking infrared, and everything radiates heat. So our cameras cannot just see that heat, but quantify it. Now, we're keen to say, like all technology, there's limitations. Just because you have an elevated skin temperature doesn't mean that you're infected. But it's a great first step, and how it works simply is you present yourself, you look at the camera, it takes a very quick reading at your tear duct, and a very sensitive detector, plus or minus 0.3 degrees Celsius, can determine if you have a fever.
Now, talk to us about where else your equipment is in place, where else it could be in place. I mean, airports, hospitals, schools.
Yes, so our history in doing this largely was in the Asia-Pacific region with SARS and N1H1, et cetera, and the main application would be at ports and borders. So screening travelers as they come in through an airport that could have a fever, and then if they are detected to have elevated skin temperatures, they'll go on for secondary screening. Again, it doesn't mean you're infected just because your skin temperature is elevated. But with this pandemic, we've seen demands from all sorts of sectors, as you could imagine. Earlier in the month, we announced a partnership with General Motors, for example, where they, as they return to work, they want to screen all their workers as they enter their factories and facilities.
Now, talk to us about what other agencies or what other companies we might see you work with. I mean, think about a company like Amazon, which has been struggling to continue deliveries but make sure its own workers are social distancing and had several outbreaks in warehouses across the country. Could we see you work with a private company like Amazon?
Amazon has adopted thermal screening technology, and while we're not at liberty to name by name a lot of the customers outside of those that have given us authorization, for example, Emirates Airlines was one of the first airlines to adopt our technology early in the spread of the pandemic to identify passengers as they board aircraft, but this has really been unprecedented. Again, in the past, our typical customer would be a airport authority or such, but we've seen inquiries from preschools, hospital networks, other government agencies, certainly from those kind of industries that are essential that people had to go into factories or distribution centers to keep our economy moving. And this tool, if used the right way, all technology has limitations, can be a very effective tool at screening out those individuals that potentially could be carrying the virus.
All right, fascinating stuff. James Cannon, the CEO of FLIR, thank you so much for joining us. Okay, still ahead, mission accomplished. A historic voyage into space. SpaceX launches 2 astronauts successfully into the final frontier. We'll speak to another astronaut about that mission coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Three, two, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon.
It finally happened. After 18 years, after multiple launches featuring commercial satellites, restocking supplies for the International Space Station, and even a Tesla, SpaceX has finally sent 2 human astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, into space. A flight that hit speeds of 17,000 miles an hour as the 2 astronauts docked at the International Space Station the next day, embracing their new roommates, marking the start of a new era for humans traveling to the final frontier.
It's also the beginning of a whole new age, a whole golden age, I believe, of commercial spaceflight. After this mission's over, we can use the same rocket, the same spacecraft, to fly non-NASA missions and take ordinary citizens up into space.
Those ordinary citizens could be hitching those interstellar rides with the likes of SpaceX, or Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin, or Virgin Galactic, or Boeing, working on its Starliner to take people to the stars. You see, 6 years ago, NASA kicked off a new space race, awarding $3.1 billion to SpaceX and $4.8 billion to Boeing, in the hopes of getting humans back to this point of space travel, hoping to end America's reliance on Russian Soyuz rockets used to transport astronauts since the last space shuttle took flight nearly 9 years ago.
It's a huge milestone for NASA, for the country. It's a huge milestone for our company, SpaceX. But it's just the next milestone, and there'll be milestones after this. And SpaceX is already working on a much bigger rocket, the Starship, and so there's a lot of exciting things still yet to come.
A milestone that might one day help fulfill Elon Musk's original vision for SpaceX, turning the human race into a spacefaring race. Emily Chang, Bloomberg, San Francisco. Welcome back. Moving on to the EU. Earlier today, Margaret Vestager, the EU's antitrust chief, spoke on Bloomberg television about various battles and issues they are dealing with there. Let's take a listen.
Of course, potential for distortion is much bigger when you enter into recapitalization, which is why, of course, the strings attached if a state recapitalizes an airline, those strings are much more serious. Bonuses are cut for senior management, there's a dividend ban, there's no share buyback programs, and of course potential distortions of competition as such in the market will have to be dealt with.
How do you perceive, ma'am, that the businesses will pay back the bailouts, the loans, however you want to phrase it? What is the vision you have of how they will pay these huge billion-dollar loans back over the years?
I don't know, as little as anyone else, how the airline industry will develop. I think we will see a lot of innovation in that industry in order both to get people back to flying, but also to green that entire industry. And obviously, they will come into the recovery with debts. And this is, of course, why also recapitalization comes into the picture. And that obviously will strengthen some companies when they have the state on board with substantial amounts of capital. And this is why we need to introduce also remedies to the distortion of competition in the Lufthansa case, slots being made available in both Frankfurt and Munich.
Commissioner, should the Lufthansa deal be seen as a guidepost for remedies that you would seek in other state aid cases when equity is involved?
That goes without saying, because we have an obligation of equal treatment, of course. The Lufthansa case is the first case of recapitalization. We need notification if a case is more than 250 million euros in order to look into whether or not competition is distorted if it's a company with market power.
EU antitrust chief there, Margaret Vestager, speaking earlier about airplanes. Now moving on from airplanes and back to space travel. Those 2 astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, landed on the International Space Station over the weekend. Joining us now to discuss another NASA astronaut, Mike Fink, who was a test pilot on the very first Starliner crewed flight. He's an active NASA astronaut and has spent 381 days in space. Mike, got to get your space cred in there. But first of all, obviously, this was a historic mission. You know, I have several children. My 7-year-old son is dying to know, what are the astronauts doing there now? What's going through their heads?
Emily, great to be on with you. And I used to be one of those 7-year-old kids and wanting to be an astronaut. And I was very lucky with a lot of hard work. And we're building a future where more young kids can grow up to be astronauts, boys and girls of all shapes and sizes. And we'll be able to have a lot of really cool business opportunities in space. So Bob and Doug are up there. They were on the first time that outside of flying with the Russians and the Soyuz, which is a government-to-government kind of contract. We have the U.S. government having a contract with a private space company for transportation to space. Bob and Doug are going to be aboard the International Space Station for the next 1 to 4 months. We're still seeing how much time we need them up there and how the Starliner is holding up in its maiden voyage to space. Starliner. The Crew Dragon is holding up on its maiden voyage to space, and we'll see how it goes. But they're going to be up on board, and they're going to do some fantastic science. They're talking about sending Bob out with the Chris Cassidy, who came up on a Soyuz, and they'll maybe do some EVAs, some spacewalks together. So this is an exciting time. We need their help for all the time it takes to do science aboard our space station. And in the meantime, they did a test flight of a brand new spaceship. How cool is that?
That is incredibly cool. Now, you are going to be doing the very same thing they just did on Boeing's version of the spacecraft, the Starliner, as you mentioned. How is that going, and what's going through your mind as you prepare for this mission? We've got about a minute left.
My crew and myself, we carefully watched Bob and Doug and all the things that they had to do. We're going to have a very similar mission, similar mission profile, a similar launch pad. We're just going to be down the coast, maybe about 2 miles, flying on a different rocket. We'll be launching on the venerable Atlas V, and so we're looking forward to our turn. Boeing has been working really hard in building our spacecraft and testing it out. So we're in the middle of ground testing right now. And we're hoping to do an uncrewed test flight later this year to repeat, but better, what we did last year. And then maybe at the end of this year or early next year, we can get on board and go to the space station just like Bob and Doug.
All right. Well, I'm going to go outside after this and talk to my 7-year-old about what you just said, who is watching right now. Mike Fink of NASA, good luck as you prepare for your own mission. And thank you so much for stopping by.
To your 7-year-old and wishing them a great opportunity for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. So much fun to watch. Mike Fink of NASA. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We'll see you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.